I greet you all, dear students, and I welcome you once again to our class. I believe this is our fourth week of covering content on research. We have covered quite a bit. You've been given an assignment in groups to come up with a concept paper. And as you may have noted from our lecture for that time, the core of that the core subject of that assignment is identification of a research problem, formulation of a research problem. This is the first step to us becoming researchers. So what was the part that we missed out, if you remember from that lecture that we had? The part that we had not covered was research methods, or sometimes referred to as research strategies. How is it you're going to tackle that research problem? How are you going to solve that research problem? So this is what we want to cover in the next two videos that we have lined up. In this video, we're going to focus on research philosophy. And in the next one, we shall look at the research methods or strategies. Those words we shall use interchangeably as we go along. So what shall we cover in the two videos and the lectures that will follow? One, we are going to start looking at the philosophies. We shall look at the philosophies and the approaches in this video. In the second video, we are going to focus on strategies or methods and validity and reliability of your research. Ethical issues, we shall cover those in a discussion in the class, but this is a key point of research. So let us start with the philosophy. First, to understand how we come to a research philosophy, we must understand that the research process is a kind of an onion. As you all know what an onion is, an onion is made up of layers, which layers you peel until you can peel until you come to the core of that vegetable. But that's what research is, a kind of an onion. It has several layers. Some layers we stipulate them in our proposals, in our concept papers, and finally in our report. Other layers are implied, but they are not necessarily stipulated or stated. So although we looked at the research process in our previous lecture, this was more stating the steps that one takes. But what I'm going to go through now is the scientific side of things. So here on this slide, we have a diagram with an image of a kind of onion with several layers. So let us begin with what we see here, the word phenomena. So the phenomena would refer to the research problem, the research area, the thing that you want to focus on, the area that you want to focus on in your research. So you would have identified your phenomena or your problem, the area that you want to tackle. Then the next question is, how do I tackle it? You begin with your approach, which is the research philosophy. Now, the research philosophy is not necessarily stated that, oh, this is my research philosophy. But at the back of your head as a researcher, you know this is how I am going to approach this subject. And we're going to go through the different philosophies. This is how I'm going to approach it as a researcher. So that is the research philosophy. Then you have your research approach. So your research approach is dependent on the philosophy. These two are dependent on one another. Once you identify your philosophy, how you're going to approach it, how you're going to tackle this, how the view that you're going to use, then you decide on your approach. The approach then determines the strategy or the method that you use. The method also then determines the time it will take to carry out your research. Then these two determine the data collection method or techniques. Now, the data collection methods are things like using your questionnaires, using interviews, observation, literature review, whatever it is that those determine. So it is actually, this is the process. Although, like I said, in the previous lecture, we looked at, should I say, the steps it takes for you to come up with your report, finally, the report which you present. Here we are now talking about the scientific side of things, of the research process of selecting your philosophy, your strategy or method, and eventually collecting that data. Yeah, so it's not a contradiction. This one is the soft side, which is extremely important. It isn't methodology, it isn't a step-by-step process. It is step-by-step, but this one requires a bit more thinking. It is the technical side of the process we discussed in the previous lecture. So let us look at research philosophies. Now, like any philosophy, a philosophy is a thinking behind something. I'm sure all of you have done philosophy on the side of ethics. I know all students of UMO must do courses on ethics, and ethics also has for you to deal with ethics, you must also have a philosophical side of things. What do we mean? What do I mean by looking at the philosophical side of things? In terms of ethics, all of you are faced with the ethical considerations in life on how you're going to deal with anything in life, how you're going to respond to certain situations. I'll give you an example. There are those who will say, for me to make an ethical decision on something, it will depend on how many people are going to benefit. If I may decide to, let's say I'm the head of a family and I need to feed 15 people and I need to make that money. So what then do I do? Well, then I can decide to go and steal, go and rob from somebody and come and feed these people. And I justify that by stealing a certain amount of things, stealing from somebody else, I'm able to get money which can then feed 15 people. And it justifies and makes my decision ethical because I am doing something, hurting one person, but satisfying X amount of people, which basically comes to the philosophical thinking that the end justifies the means. Then you have another person who says, no, the ends do not justify, the end does not justify the means. If I'm going to trample on the freedoms of another, I'm going to affect another. So those are different philosophical thinkings that are guiding somebody's decision making on ethical matters. So now, what about in research? It's more or less the same thing. There is a philosophical thinking that guides you in your research. Yeah. So the first one we have here on this slide is positivism. So positivism is usually taken on by those who are carrying out quantitative research. We've had discussions on quantitative research before, and I'm sure you still remember what quantitative research is. So here, when a researcher is taking up a positivism research philosophy, what they are basically saying is that they are taking an objective, analytical view of life. Yeah, they are looking at those things that are observable realities within a certain context. Here, I'll give you an example. We can say, if we say in society that there are X number of girls within any given society, these girls, once they go to school, an X number will drop out because of pregnancy. Therefore, we can deduce, or we can come to the conclusion that early childhood pregnancy affects the education of the girl child. Yeah, early childhood pregnancy affects the education of the girl child. So that is a positivism philosophy. And once I come up with that deduction, and once I come up with data, I demonstrate that, I can then translate that to any other society, be it in Uganda, in Kenya, and so on and so forth. That is a positivism style philosophy, where we generalize. You come up with a law-like generalization, which generalization can now be translated to others. You found it in this context, we can then now push it to other areas. So that is a positivism outlook on research, when you are coming up with those generalizations. So now when you see here, it normally depends on statistical analysis, which means for you to come up with that generalization, you may have, let's say, done a study on, let's say, if we have, as I said, 25, let's assume Uganda's population is 40, and half of that, or usually women are more than men, maybe 25 million are women, and of those 25 million, let us say 15 million, 15 million would categorize them as being below 18, and then we pick out a sample of those 15 million, a certain an acceptable sample size, and we do a study on them and find out that several of them, a certain percentage, dropped out because of school, because of early of pregnancy. Therefore, we come up with that deduction. So here you realize that we took a statistical analysis of a certain number of girls in Uganda, and that number of girls represents all girls within Uganda who are under the age of 18. Therefore, we come up with that generalization. Yes, we come up with that generalization. So this is the positivism philosophy. So you see that it really focuses on quantitative, that means large amounts of data. And then the conclusion we come, because we have so many people coming out as positive on a certain matter, then that means it leads them to another conclusion. So that is essentially positivism. Then we come to the opposite, which normally comes with qualitative research, interpretivism. Sorry, let me try to pronounce that very well. So now, let us first of all differentiate the word, because this philosophy comes from the word to interpret. To interpret is not the same as to translate. Sometimes those two words are interchanged. What do I mean? We have situations, let us say you have a situation where there is a pastor who is preaching maybe in English, and you have somebody who is translating what he's saying into a local language for the church congregation to understand what he or she is saying. Translation is not the same as to interpret. Yeah, the two are not the same. To interpret is to try to understand the meaning behind something. So the person who is translating, for example, the person who is translating for a pastor is literally translating what the person is saying from one language to another, precisely, so that the person who listens then picks the meaning behind it. Okay? That is the best way I can explain it. So what does it mean to interpret as opposed to translate? You're given a certain text. Maybe it's a poem. A poem is a perfect example, because a poem doesn't necessarily state what the person wants to say, but out of the words and the tone in which somebody speaks something, or the tone in which somebody writes something, you get the gist of what somebody is trying to say, somebody is trying to bring forward. If you look at literary works of people like William Shakespeare, the language he used, and I remember there is one, I think, one play of his where he talks in Hamlet, where he begins his narration by saying, "To be or not to be." So it's a weird statement for someone to say to be or not to be. What does that person mean? What to interpret that? What that person is essentially saying, to be alive or not to be alive. The person was basically contemplating suicide. In the simplest terms, that's what the person was contemplating, suicide. So it's a tragic, even just the beginning of it, you understand that there's tragedy, or there is some kind of tragedy or heartache that is in a certain situation, and the person is contemplating, should I even be alive at this particular moment? So that there, what I'm doing is interpreting the play, what the person was saying, what the playwright was trying to bring forward. Now, here, when we bring it back down to research, what are we saying? There are situations, especially for you people as IT research, you will be examining business situations. There could be a business situation, there could be a social development context, whatever it is. These situations are usually complex. And we simply can't generalize, as in the situation with positivism, where we pull out a certain number of people and we say, because this number of people say this, therefore it means this. We normally, especially in IT, we normally can't just create such generalizations. Not that we can't have them in IT, we can, but normally the type of research we have doesn't allow us to make those generalizations. And therefore, we need to take up more or less of an interpretivism philosophy to our research. So essentially, what we are saying with this philosophy is that we need to understand the realities of a given, within a certain given context. And we also recognize that the people who are in these different situations interpret situations differently. And therefore, the meaning we bring out of a certain research or a certain phenomena, a certain problem, it differs, it creates different meanings. Let me just even go further. In the last lecture we had, somebody wanted, one of you in the group wanted to discuss cybersecurity. Now, looking at it, it may seem quite straightforward. We need cybersecurity. But for different users within a certain context, it's different. For example, if we're talking about cybersecurity, let's say in an e-learning situation or in a university situation, for the ICT team, the technical team that is going to handle the servers, the way they are going to look at cybersecurity is not the same as the end user being the student, the lecturer, or let us say the administrator within the faculty. It's different for every person. So the end user is going to want to look at the device. Is my data being picked up? My personal user details being picked up as I access the e-learning system? What is going to be used by, who is going to use my data, my personal information? My search, if I'm searching on something, who's going to look at what it is I've been searching on? Then for the the ICT personnel, they are looking at, is somebody going to access our servers? Who should access our servers? Are we going to be attacked? Is our site going to be attacked on what we call phishing? Phishing is PHI. are we going to have any attack on as far as fishing is concerned? So you realize that for everyone, they have a different perspective. So every single actor in that phenomena has a completely different worry or concern. So you really see that. I don't know if you see the difference in the two. Whereas the other one was looking at what the many believe then becomes a law. But here we're looking at the different actors, the complexities that exist for the different people. Even within the business context itself, just to even go further to show you how you're interpreting as in qualitative research really goes even further. We are still going back to the issue of a university context. Even the thinking, the general thinking of the university matters. Yeah. UMU as a university, as a Catholic founded university, will not have the same outlook as Makerere University, which is a public university. Their outlooks are completely different. Same goes for, let's say, a university like UCU and UMU. The two are both private universities, the two are both Christian universities, but still Christian universities from two different Christian perspectives. So even those may affect the way the business runs or how it operates. Yeah. So you realize that where interpretivism really comes in to understand the complexities of a phenomena, depending on what context we're looking at. Then we have our third philosophy, which is realism. Now, realism tries to combine the two. Realism tries to combine the two philosophies, which is positivism and interpretivism. It tries to bring the two together because the two you can have extremes of both, but realism tries to bring the two together, a mixture of the two together. Why? There are times when we have to make generalizations. There are times when we don't have to make generalizations. What do we mean? In IT, specifically in IT, we have certain theories which basically try to cover both. One that I can think of the top of my head is the term theory, which is the technology acceptance model. This model was developed specifically to determine or try to determine if a technology is going to be accepted or not. Now, if we're looking at technology adoption, we essentially must understand that someone will accept a technology. Let's say, for example, in UMU we adopted Zivasti. It has been used now for a few years now, since from 2016 to now. There are different thinkings to it. There are those who have adopted it outwardly and said, yes, we are going to use it. There are those who have said no. And people have their different reasons for it. Now, somebody can decide, I'm going to try and find out about why it has been adopted by some and why it has not been adopted by others. What is the reasoning behind it? Someone can say, I'm going to use term. And term has certain theories or hypotheses that it poses. For example, term says that for a woman to take on a technology, to accept a technology, they must find it easy to use. Most female users will say, I will take on this technology if I find it easy to use. And then term also says that for male users to take on a technology, they must find it useful. So someone can say, I'm going to use term to try and determine why it has been accepted why Zivasti has been accepted by some and rejected by others. Another one may say, no, I'm going to take that by taking term theory, basically what the person is saying is that I am going to take a positivism philosophical outlook. Essentially, that's what they're saying. Another will say I'm going to take the interpretivism fashion philosophy, where I try to understand the different users, why they have refused to take on this technology, and those who have accepted. What was the reasoning behind it? To understand that relationship. Why did they come up? Why did they decide to take a certain course of action? Then realism is somebody saying, I'm going to take both approaches. I'm going to look at the usefulness and ease of use, and at the same time, I'm also going to take a qualitative outlook. I'm going to try to understand. That person, what they're basically doing is coming up with taking up a realism philosophical outlook, combining the two philosophies. I hope we've understood, but we shall have greater discussion within with our face-to-face classes to see if we can cover up areas that we don't understand. Now, once you've picked your philosophy, your philosophical, once you've picked to say that I'm going to use this approach, or this philosophy, then you decide on your approach. What approach you intend to use within your research. So we have two, deductive and inductive. So the two, of course, are dependent on the philosophical approach. So deductive essentially starts from a positivism philosophical approach and basically depends on theory and hypothesis. Theory and a hypothesis. Now, with hypothesis, these are terms you rarely find in IT, rarely, especially with the type of research you're going to have at undergraduate level. You may have it at postgraduate level, but at undergraduate level, you rarely find somebody's thesis use a term like hypothesis. We can have a greater discussion on hypothesis, but most of the time you rarely find it with IT undergraduate classes. Then you have the deductive. So inductive, sorry. The inductive is the very opposite of deductive. With deductive, somebody is starting from a theory, an existing theory. For example, I gave you in IT an example of term, which has certain hypotheses. I gave you some of those examples. A hypothesis, when term states that female users will accept a technology largely because they find it easy to use. That is a hypothesis. It's an existing theory, an assumption. But that assumption someone didn't just come up with it. They carried out certain research and formulated that theory or that hypothesis. So that's where they're coming from. Inductive, on the other hand, does the opposite. It's the opposite of deductive. So the person goes out to collect data, tries to understand something, and once they understand that thing, they conceptualize it and develop a theory as a result of that. Now, don't worry, within your research, you're not going to develop theory. You will use existing methods and theories to collect data, but you won't come up with a theory. Yeah, but most of the time your research will be inductive. A little bit of deductive will be there, but it will be inductive. So let us look at deductive research approach in detail. So as we've discussed in brief, it starts from a hypothesis, which comes from a theory. A hypothesis, again, is an assumption which is based on research. So it's not an assumption that we come up with it from off the top of our heads. So I'll give an example of an assumption I may give, which is completely baseless. I may say girls are usually, I may give a statement like, girls are usually not good at IT. Yeah, I may give that statement. That statement is baseless because there is no research anywhere that says girls are not good at IT. That is absolutely not true. I'll give you an example. The new upgrade to MySQL, which is Maria, was developed by a woman. That's why the new name has come up. The upgrade of MySQL, which is now Maria, is based on the one who developed it, a woman called Maria. So it's absolutely not true when we say that when somebody makes that assumption. So that assumption, that so-called hypothesis, which is actually not a hypothesis, is baseless. So the hypothesis itself must be based on research. So but there's the example I gave you of term is actually based on research. So that hypothesis you're going to start your research on is basically coming from an existing theory. Then that hypothesis is then turned into operational terms. That means the researcher will state something like, let's say from term theory, where we say female users will take on a technology if they find it easy to use. Then they will maybe put that into specific terms and say, female users have rejected Zvaste because they find it difficult to use. And male users have accepted it because they found it useful or they found it not useful. So the person decides, I'm going to go and test this hypothesis. I'm going to give out questionnaires and design my questionnaire based on those operational terms. Why have you rejected Zvaste? Why have you accepted it? And they get their data based on that. So then they will find out whether Zvaste is easy to use or not easy to use. These questions come up. Then we test. That is what by testing the hypothesis is the person goes out and delivers or distributes questionnaires to test that hypothesis. Yeah, and then they will come out with a yes or no, and they will determine at the end, is Zvaste easy to use or not easy to use? Is it useful or is it not useful? Those questions are then determined. After examining, they modify the theory. Yeah, they modify their thinking behind why Zvaste is accepted or not accepted. So here I have an example, a typical example from social research. Let us say you're doing research on a retail store and you want to find out why there's a high rate of absenteeism. And there may be a theory saying those who are older skip work a lot more, probably because they are sick more. And the person decides to go out and do that research. So now here you realize that the methodology is highly structured. It's very precise. We have this belief, we give out questionnaires based on that belief or that hypothesis, and we get results based on that. Very structured, extremely structured, and you realize that at the end we have generalizations. Yeah, you select a sample size, a certain amount of people, and then you say, let us determine if this is true or false. So this is highly structured, and at the end we generalize. Let's come now to inductive, the very opposite of deductive. Let's come to inductive. So here you have a specific problem and you want to understand why something is happening. Yeah, why something is happening. It is the same thing as deductive, but you recognize that the problem is specific. Whereas the person, let us go back to the example of Zvaste there. The person of Zvaste was the person who's using term decided to make those assumptions based on usefulness and ease of use, those two areas, usefulness and ease of use. And by the way, you don't have to limit it to male only. You can say, you can even ask the men, do you find Zvaste easy to use? Even the men may tell you, no, I don't find it easy to use, or yes, I find it easy to use. And even the females, you may have the same thing, and you can also ask them, do you find it useful? You can ask the very same question. But in inductive, the person would say, no, I want to go beyond that. I want to go back and ask the users. You may find somebody says, for me, I decided to use Zivaste because I want to make my, I really want to try out something new. And Zivaste is something new. Another person will say, no, for me, I say no because of another reason. Maybe I don't like the providers. There are people who I absolutely don't like. I've seen them. I don't like their attitude. I don't like the way they came in. And my answer is no. So now you find that the reasoning is very different from what the hypothesis says. So you come up with another theory. You basically formulate another theory which term has not catered for, about why people have refused to take on a certain technology. Yeah? So you make sense of the data. Unlike, yes, you're making sense with deductive, but with deductive, you're essentially saying, with inductive, you're essentially saying there are other underlying issues which the theory doesn't focus on. So what are the major differences between the two? One of the major differences I can tell you is that deductive is quantitative, looks at quantitative style of research. Inductive looks at qualitative. That is one of the major differences that we can see. Another major difference is that deductive comes from theory to data. Inductive is looking at getting the data and then coming up with theory. Deductive, looks at causal relationships. This causes this. Something is not useful, I don't take it up. I find it useful, I take it up. This one is trying to understand. Inductive is trying to understand. In other words, it's trying to understand new relationships in a situation. Deductive has a lot of controls to ensure data validity. On the other hand, with qualitative or inductive, things may change. Whereas deductive, the flow of the research is very linear, and you do not take up another side. If I'm going to look at specifically Zivaste on its ease of use and usability and usefulness, on this side, on inductive, I will find other variables, things that affect the adoption of this technology. So what that does, it creates flexibility in your structure. I gave you an example. I don't know if I gave you this. I told you about my experience with my research, which was largely qualitative, where I had come up with a solution, but then I had to change that solution basing on the context. The context, the doctors were saying, you've brought us this solution, which is depending on SMS and voice calls, and they were saying, I'm sorry, but we as doctors, we don't have that time to sit down and start making video calls. Said, secondly, we do not give diagnosis remotely. We want to see a patient. Then there was also the other flip side where I went to community members and they were saying, we don't know how to use SMS. So in that sense, my research had to be flexible. I had to change the way I was thinking. That is typically inductive research. Whereas you have generalization in deductive, generalizations are not there. We look at in inductive research, where we look at the context when we have different users in the play, which different users have different ideas and the way they look at things. So the question should be, which approach should I take, since we've now looked at extensively at these two approaches, deductive or inductive? Which research should I take up? Which approach should I take up? Well, number one, you look at theory. Which theoretical framework can help you answer your question? Yeah, you've right now looked at your areas of research. You may be asking yourself, which approach really can help me answer my question? What amount of literature exists? You may be doing research which has been researched extensively, and in all sincerity, there's not much else to understand about that research. So in that case, I may decide to take a deductive approach. The research, you may find your literature is limited, and if your research is limited, then you may decide, let me take up an inductive approach. We really need to understand more. So inductive approach is trying to understand more. The next is time. How much time do you have? Deductive is very quick. Decide on a hypothesis, distribute your questionnaires, and get back a response. Inductive takes up more time because trying to understand people and their situation takes time. Then there is also risk. Deductive has a lower risk, is a lower risk strategy. Inductive means that you may have to discover more than what you intended. Then the other one is your audience. Yeah, who are you writing to? Then the final one is who will mark or / who will pay you for your research. Normally, my advice here, you may be at loggerheads wondering, what am I going to do? Combine the two. Most of the time, you may need to combine the two. I have said this before. Normally, IT research will lean more towards qualitative because you're trying to understand the situation so you can create a system that will answer the problem of that your context. Usually, it's qualitative, but you bring in a bit of positivism also in the middle of it. So your research normally lies between it's normally realistic or realism. You're taking a realism philosophical approach, and therefore you may want to combine the two, deductive and inductive, but leaning more towards inductive. Yeah. So we need to have a clear research strategy. Once you've understood what you want to do, you then pick and adopt an appropriate strategy. So why is the research approach important? Is it possible to combine? Which one should I adopt? Those are questions that you will ask yourself, especially when you want to now pick your research strategy. Once you understand the approach you want to take, picking your research strategy or research method becomes clearer and clearer. In the videos that will follow, in the video that follows, we are going to look at the different research strategies or research methods. Automatically, some you will know these are they are out of my depth, they are out of IT and where I want to go, especially if I'm going to develop a system. So therefore, I'm not going to use a certain strategy or certain method. So we are going to look at that in our next video. So I thank you for listening. Please take note of any questions. I may have rushed through certain things. I may have been very abstract in certain explanations, but we shall have the face-to-face and we shall go in depth with those areas. So I thank you for listening.